Hello, everyone. This is the 119th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle of the 1888 Letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview Scottish author Mr. Stephen Murray as we discuss Aberdeen's performances in the European competitions in the decade of the 1980s. Mr. Murray is the author of Celtic related books 10 Men Who Won the League and Kenny of the Celtic. He is also a contributor to Celtic Underground. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you very much.
Before we dive into Aberdeen's performances in this decade of the 1980s, can you describe the state of the affairs with Aberdeen's past European performances in the 1970s and the changes following the arrival of Alex Ferguson in 1978?
Yeah, the first thing to point out is that it was very hard for Aberdeen in those days to actually qualify for Europe because they were a decent team at domestic level, but there was a lot of competition. Obviously, Celtic and Rangers were very strong, and you also had a very good Hibs team at the time. And believe it or not, Dundee for a couple of seasons in the 70s qualified for Europe. In the years that they did qualify for Europe, they actually were very unlucky to draw some very stiff opposition. In 1971, they faced Juventus and they put up a very good show against, Juventus at any time are very talented. And at that stage, they had the world's most expensive footballer, a guy called Pietro Anastasi. So Aberdeen were unlucky over the two legs to lose. In 1972, they faced Borussia Mönchengladbach. Again, there was no disgrace. They lost over two legs. The Borussia team at the time, probably in the shadow of Bayern Munich a wee bit, which was very unlucky because they had some wonderful players. They had Günter Netzer, Jupp Heynckes, Bertie Vogts, Rainer Bonhoff. They were, for a period in the 1970s again, they were one of the best teams in Europe. So again, Aberdeen unlucky with the draw to get such standard of opposition. And then in 1973, they faced a Spurs side, Tottenham Hotspur, who actually got to the final of the UEFA Cup that year and beat Aberdeen along the way. But again, Aberdeen put up a decent showing. They were never embarrassed in these games. I think against Juventus at home, they got a draw. Against Spurs at home, they got a draw. It was probably exciting for Aberdeen fans to see such talented teams come to Pittodrie. But what made it hard for them was that they weren't able to hold on to their best players and they lost Martin Buchan to Manchester United and Joe Harper to Everton between 1971 and 1972. So for a period, they weren't in European football until 1977. By that time, Billy McNeil was the manager and they lost to Molenbeek in the first round, which was a big disappointment at the time. And then when Alex Ferguson came, 1978, they lost to Fortuna Dusseldorf. And in 1979, they lost to Eintracht Frankfurt. The Frankfurt game, I think they lost in away goals. They were very, very unlucky. So up to that point, they are a team who have great potential, but haven't really shown that potential within the European stage.
They advanced no more than the first or the second round in those years. Of course, Sir Alex Ferguson, Alex Ferguson at this point, he had been the manager of St. Mirren before that, and obviously he would transform the club into this coming decade. Before we look into Aberdeen's exploits in Europe in this early part of the decade, how significant was their league title win in 1980 that broke the Celtic Rangers domination?
That was very significant because it was the first time in 15 years, 15 seasons, that a club from outside of Glasgow had won the league. The previous side had been Kilmarnock in 1965. To be honest, it was a bit of a shock. Not the fact that Aberdeen won it, but in the manner in which they won it, because they were behind Celtic in the league race right up until probably the middle of April. And they had two very notable wins at Celtic Park within the space of about 3 weeks. The first game they won 2-1, and the second game they played even better, and they were very convincing 3-1 winners. So although they came in with a late run to win the league, I don't think there's any doubt that having beaten Celtic their closest rivals twice in the space of a few weeks. They were deserving winners of that title. Some of the players who had been performing, to be honest, at a fairly ordinary level, now began to excel. And I'm thinking of the likes of Gordon Strachan, who had been with Aberdeen for a couple of seasons and hadn't really developed into the player they'd hoped. And all of a sudden, he began to play really well. And then Steve Archibald blossomed into a wonderful striker, both at club and international level. And Archibald, in the back of that, got a move to Spurs for a record-breaking £800,000 deal that summer. So yes, it was very significant. The potential was definitely there for them to move on from that, and I think people knew when they won the league that they had made their mark. And as you said previously, there that within the European game, they hadn't really done it yet, so it remained to be seen what they could do.
So this paved the way for participation in the Champions Cup for the 1980-81 season. That season's tournament, 1980-81. In the first round, they faced Austrian side FK Austria, and they just squeaked by in this first round. They defeated the Austrian side 1-0 at home and came away with a scoreless tie at Vienna and moved to the second round. In the second round, they faced the mighty Liverpool, who had won the Champions Cup twice before, and they would win it that season. The first leg in October 22nd at Pittodrie, Liverpool came away with a 1-0 win. 2 weeks later, on November 5th, Liverpool demolished Aberdeen 4-0, and Aberdeen were out. Was this loss against Liverpool a learning lesson for Ferguson in terms of tactics in Europe for the following years?
The first point I would make here is that when they beat FK Vienna 1-0 in aggregate, the second leg, for the first time, it showed that the triumvirate of Leighton, Miller and McLeish, Leighton being the Aberdeen goalkeeper and Miller and McLeish being the centre-backs, this was the backbone of the great Aberdeen team that was to come. And that was the first example that I can recall that Aberdeen could go to difficult places in away from home in Europe and basically put the barriers up and get a good result. And you're right to say there that it was a slender 1-0 lead. Second leg they defended and they showed that they were capable of doing that. Now, when they faced Liverpool, that was a totally different proposition because Liverpool at that time were the best team in Europe. They were at their peak. And it has to be said that Aberdeen were very unlucky with injuries in those games because they didn't have a big squad at the time. And in the second leg at Anfield, they were required to play two teenagers, Andy Dorn and Neil Cooper, who from memory were only 18 and had played a handful of games between them. So, in honesty, those games came too soon for that Aberdeen team. And Aberdeen fans still hold a wee grudge against Ray Kennedy, the great Liverpool player of the period, who put in a shocking tackle on a guy called John McMaster, who was a very, very good player for Aberdeen. And he received a knee injury in the back of that, which kept him out for a very, very long time. So there was a wee bit of bitterness from the Aberdeen people. It wasn't that they lost. I think they felt that Liverpool had targeted McMaster because he was such a good player. In the second leg, there wasn't really a lot that Aberdeen could do with the injuries and everything against them. Liverpool being on the top of their game, there was really only going to be one winner during that game. He would undoubtedly have picked up on those things that Liverpool did over the two games because they were by far the best team in Europe during the 1980s. But I think it also showed him that his team weren't quite yet at the level that Liverpool were and that he would have to make improvements. And in fairness to him, the good manager that he was able to make those subtle changes to his team in terms of the balance of it and in terms of bringing in new personnel that pushed him on to the next level.
For the following season, 1981-82, Aberdeen is involved in the UEFA Cup. In the first round, they would face the defending UEFA Cup champions, Ipswich Town, managed by Bobby Robson, containing a host of internationals. They came away with a 1-1 tie at Ipswich And in the second leg, they defeated Ipswich 3-1 to advance to the second round. Was this win over this strong Ipswich side another reference point for this team to gain confidence in Europe?
Very much so. It was the game in which I think that the rest of Europe actually sat up and took notice of Aberdeen for the first time. You made a very good point there about Ipswich having international players. Every outfield player, apart from the goalkeeper, Paul Cooper, was an internationalist. And not just that, a famous internationalist. UEFA Cup holders at that was the first round that they were trying to retain their trophy. And they were strong favourites against Aberdeen. I think virtually everyone outside Scotland expected Ipswich to win. But what happened in the second leg was that they signed a player called Peter Weir from St Mirren, who was a left winger, who was a very, very good player. And he absolutely destroyed the England fullback Mick Mills. I think Weir scored twice on the night, and he absolutely ran amok with the Ipswich defence. So, yeah, for the first time, people outside Scotland, not only in England but on the continent, were beginning to take notice that this Aberdeen team were something special. And having beat Ipswich, I think there was no reason for them to fear anybody else in that competition, because that Ipswich, after all, were the holders.
In the second round, they eliminated Romanian side Arges Pitești. But in the third round, they would face West German powerhouse SV Hamburg, containing the likes of Horst Hrubesch, Manfred Kals, Felix Magath, among others. And this West German side would, in fact, reach the final of the UEFA Cup that season. In this third round, Aberdeen actually defeats Hamburg in the first leg 3-2, but they lose 3-1 in the second leg and are eliminated. But again, this is just a very strong West German side. Aberdeen goes relatively far into competition.
Yeah. Our just Pitești game, players who played in that game speak of how they beat the Romanians 3-0 in the first game at Pittodrie. And then in the second leg, I think they found themselves 2-0 down fairly early on in the game. And Ferguson, probably for one of the first times it became obvious that he was a great motivator, because he got them into half time, referred to as the hairdryer treatment, where he would have a go at certain players in the team. And he got a response because Aberdeen scored twice in the second half and went through eventually fairly comfortable 5-2. But my memory of the Hamburg game was that the great Franz Beckenbauer was playing for Hamburg. And Ferguson felt that over the two games, some of his players were actually in awe of Franz Beckenbauer because he was such a great personality. Now, Beckenbauer at the time would have been probably 36, maybe 37. But just the name itself, he's one of the greatest footballers of all time. And Aberdeen were actually very good in the first leg. And I think they lost a late goal. They probably should have had a 3-1 lead. And that lead ended up at 3-2. But in the second leg in Hamburg, I think Hamburg ran out worthy winners. Mark McGee scored a goal late in the game to make it 3-1, but I think that was academic at that point. Just playing against Franz Beckenbauer, I think, would have been a great experience for the Aberdeen players. And the thing also about the Hamburg ties, it was the first time that Eric Black had came to prominence. He scored with a terrific header in the first leg at Pittodrie. And he was a player in seasons to come who would make his mark in Europe against the best of teams.
For the following season, we come to the victorious Cup Winners' Cup campaign of 1982-83. In this competition, we start with a preliminary round against Swiss side Sion. Aberdeen wins 7-0 in the first leg and 4-1 in the second leg and are comfortably through to the first round. Now, in the first round, they actually struggle a bit against the Albanian side Dinamo Tirana. They win 1-0 at the Pittodrie and come away with a scoreless tie in the second leg. For the second round, they face Polish side Lech Poznan. They win 2-0 at home and 1-0 away from home. So you're starting to see the defensive solidity of this team. as they have not given up a goal in these first two rounds. So they reached the quarterfinals for the first time. They're facing West German side Bayern Munich that contains Karl-Heinz Rummenigge, Paul Breitner, Klaus Augenthaler, just a star-studded side. The first leg is at Munich. Again, Aberdeen comes away with a scoreless tie. So another clean sheet, and this time away from home against such a good team. The second leg on March 16th, Aberdeen wins 3-2, and Bayern Munich are eliminated. Let's also remind everyone this Bayern Munich had reached the final of the Champions Cup in the previous season. This win against Bayern Munich was really, I think, the clear indication that Aberdeen were now a force in Europe.
Yeah, I think going through the opposition, Sion, Tirana, Lech Poznan, these were teams that Aberdeen at that point would expect to beat. But by the time it got to Bayern Munich, and all the glamour that you've said there, I mean, for me, the three outstanding players were Paul Breitner, Karl-Heinz Rummenigge, and Klaus Augenthaler. Augenthaler, who scored a wonderful goal that night. This was a team that were probably favourites for the tournament. Noticeable that when Aberdeen won the second leg 3-2 at Pittodrie, it became obvious, certainly in Scotland, I'm only speaking from a Scottish perspective, it became obvious that Aberdeen can go all the way and win this. Because it wasn't just that they'd beaten Bayern Munich, it was the circumstances in which they'd beat them. They were 1-0 down and they were 2-1 down in the second leg. And in both times they fought back and eventually scored the winning goal in a very, very dramatic game at Pittodrie, probably the greatest game that Pittodrie has ever witnessed. After knocking out Bayern, certainly, as I said, they're within Scotland. There was a feeling that this Aberdeen team can go all the way. The thing I would say at this point was Aberdeen had a player called Dougie Bell. Now, Dougie Bell was never really a regular first team player for Aberdeen in the way that Gordon Strachan was and Willie Miller was and Jim Leighton. But Alec Ferguson was very clever in how he fielded his teams tactically. And Dougie Bell was very good against European opposition. That's where he played his best games. And, each of the rounds that Aberdeen were playing up to the final, Dougie Bell was arguably their best player, because he was the European specialist that they brought in to play against continental sides where you were looking for something a wee bit different. And he was a very underrated player for Aberdeen during that period.
Finals, they face Belgian side Waterschei in the first leg on April 6th. They defeat them 5-1 to more or less qualify for the final. The second leg, they lose 1-0, but it was academic at this point. Every Aberdeen fan knows of this. For the final, they face the mighty Real Madrid on May 11th in Sweden at Gothenburg. We know how this match unfolds. Eric Black gives Aberdeen the lead in the 7th minute. Juanito ties the match in the 14th minute with a penalty kick. Of course, the match goes into extra time, and we all remember Mark McGee's cross and John Hewitt's header, and Alex Ferguson's Aberdeen win a European trophy against a legendary side. By the way, this was the last European final that Real Madrid has lost to date. Yes. And this Real Madrid side managed by the great Alfredo Di Stefano, containing the likes of the West German Uli Stielicke, we mentioned Juanito, of course, Carlos Santillana, among others. Can you paint a picture of the significance of this European trophy over Real Madrid in 1983?
It was very much David against Goliath. And I think on a European perspective, Aberdeen, most people within European football outside of Spain would have wanted Aberdeen to win because they were clear underdogs. Despite having beaten Bayern Munich, as you said yourself there, this was the great Real Madrid. We thought their pedigree, their European history, the great players that they had at the time. And one of the things that I do recall was Alfredo Di Stefano, certainly in Scotland, is held in the highest esteem because he played at Hampden in 1960 with the great Real Madrid side who beat Eintracht 7-3. So there was always a legendary status for Di Stefano. He was held in such great respect. I think what Ferguson did before the game was very clever, is he took Jock Stein with the Aberdeen squad to almost counteract the presence of Di Stefano, because Stein also had that great presence in the European game, having won the European Cup with Celtic in 1967. I think in terms of morale for the club and in terms of PR, that was a very important move. What did become obvious was that tactically, Aberdeen had learned to play a very patient European game, organised at the back. They had good players who could keep possession in midfield, and they had players with pace up front. So they were always going to be a hard nut to crack for Real Madrid. I think the one advantage that Aberdeen had was that the final was played in Gothenburg. Now that's in Northern Europe, but the climate is a wee bit more close to what we enjoy in Scotland. I do have reservations if the final had been played in Southern Europe, in Portugal or Greece or Italy, or a country which had a very hot climate. I think it would have been more difficult for Aberdeen. So in terms of good fortune, then that was a good thing for them. But on the day, they outplayed Madrid. The Madrid's goal came from a mistake by Alec McLeish, which caused a penalty. And Aberdeen should really have won that game in the 90 minutes. And they were very deserving winners to do it in extra time. As I said there, that the players like Strachan and Miller, Willie Miller and Mark McGee now became household names. And Alec Ferguson himself had carved a great reputation as a manager within the European game, and became very, very well known in the back of that victory.
Thanks to this victory, they were now eligible to play in the UEFA Super Cup against the European champions SV Hamburg. These matches were played late in the year, in November and December 1983. The first leg was at Hamburg, and Aberdeen came away with a scoreless tie. The second leg on December 20th, Aberdeen defeated Hamburg 2-0 to collect their second European trophy. This UEFA Super Cup win showed Aberdeen's vast improvements against the same opponent that had eliminated them just a couple of years before. Was this really the zenith of the Aberdeen adventure in Europe?
The answer to that is undoubtedly yes. I think the first thing that goes without saying is that Hamburg were European champions. They'd beaten Juventus in the European Cup final. For Aberdeen to take on the European champions and beat them very convincingly, I've got to say, over the two games, again, it wasn't a fortunate victory. This was very well deserved, particularly the second leg at Pittodrie. And by now, Aberdeen feared no one at Pittodrie. I mean, literally, they could have taken on any team in the world at that point, and they would have been confident of beating them. So they were no longer in awe of any opponents, and they were tactically as good as any European side. And as you said there, 2 years previously, playing Hamburg had been a wee bit too much for them. So it shows you what they had learned in the 2 year period in terms of being more tactically aware. And also, to be fair, Ferguson had brought in very, very good players. One of the things I should have said about the European Cup Winners' Cup final against Real Madrid was that in the weeks leading up to that game, Stuart Kennedy, who was the Aberdeen right back and had been Scotland's right back in the 1978 World Cup finals in Argentina, received an injury in one of the European games, and he had to sadly retire from football on the back of it. Kennedy had been the Aberdeen right back for many, many years. So for the final, what Ferguson had to do is he had to move Doug Rugby from left back to right back and play John McMaster, who was essentially a midfield player. He played him at left back. So for any team, that would be a huge blow. But I think it showed what a good manager Ferguson was, that he could cope with such a bad blow and make an adjustment to his team that would help. And by the time they played Hamburg, late 1983, he'd signed a guy called Stuart McKimmie, who was from Dundee, who was Kennedy's replacement at right back. And Stuart McKimmie was to be the Aberdeen right back for many years to come, and Scotland's. And he was a very, very influential player. So not only were Aberdeen learning tactically, but Ferguson still had a great eye for talent. He'd signed Peter Weir, and now he'd signed Stuart McKimmie, who made his team from teams within Scotland who were making his team stronger. And there's no doubt that the Aberdeen team in 1983 was far stronger than the team who had played Hamburg 2 years previously.
We've already mentioned some of the names, but let's describe the backbone of this great Aberdeen side. So we have Jim Leighton in goal, and the defensive stalwarts, Alex McLeish and Willie Miller, the captain, in the center of defense. Gordon Strachan, who's gaining a reputation as a quality international. Eric Black, Mark McGee as a striker, and other names we mentioned, Doogie Bell, Peter Weir, Jason McMaster, going through Neil Simpson. A lot of players who made their way into the national team through their performances in Europe.
Well, the obvious backbone was the goalkeeper, the two centre-backs. The goalkeeper being Jim Leighton and the two centre-backs being Willie Miller and Alec McLeish. Leighton wasn't the biggest goalkeeper, but he was very agile and he was a great shot stopper. Willie Miller and Alec McLeish were the ideal centre-back pairing because McLeish was very dominant in the air and he had pace. Willie Miller tended to play behind him as a sweeper. And Miller's talent was that he was a phenomenal tackler, penalty box defender who was best with his back to goal. Certainly in my lifetime, he's the best Scottish defender that I can recall. At that time, Scotland were blessed with the likes of Alan Hansen and David Narey, who were phenomenal footballers in their own right. But I think Miller just had something about him. He had quite a mean streak as well. He was ruthless when he had to be, and he was a leader on the pitch. He was the captain. He was the guy that they all looked up to. So that was the basis of the success. However, for me, the jewel in the crown was undoubtedly Gordon Strachan. Gordon Strachan had blossomed at Aberdeen and became a truly world-class player. I mean, as far back as 1982, he was exceptional for Scotland in the World Cup finals. Aberdeen actually did well to keep Strachan between 82 and 84, where virtually any big team in Europe would have bitten your hand off to sign a player of his pedigree. He was the main creative hub in the team. He could dribble. He was a great passer. He was a great crosser. He scored goals. He was just quite a unique player, one of those players that you come across probably once in a generation, in the same way that Jimmy Johnson had been to Celtic in the 1960s. Gordon Strachan was to Aberdeen in the 1980s. And alongside him, as the creative hub of the team, I've already mentioned Doogie Bell in detail. And on the left wing, to give the team balance, you had Peter Weir, who was very, very capable of beating fullbacks, crossing a good ball, and he scored a lot of goals. But the important thing tactically for Aberdeen was, as good as the defence was, Ferguson protected the defence. And it's the first time in my life that I actually remember the phrase holding midfield player being mentioned with Aberdeen, because you had two guys who were quite exceptional at that. One was Neil Simpson, a hard-working, hard-tackling player. Another one was Neil Cooper, who was a very aggressive midfield player. So in games where Aberdeen were going to be under pressure, Ferguson's tendency was to play Simpson and Cooper in front of the back four, so that even before you get to that great Aberdeen defence, you've got to get past these two guys, which certainly wasn't an easy task. And then up front, Mark McGee was the main man. He was a very strong running player, very mobile and strong. And then alongside him, it tended to be Eric Black or John Hewitt, depending on the opposition.
The following season, 1983-84, Aberdeen are once more in the Cup Winners' Cup as defending champions. In the first round, they face Icelandic side Akrans. They win 2-1 away from home and they tie 1-1 at home and advance to the next round. In the next round, they meet Belgian side Beveren, who would actually win the Belgian league title that season. So away from home, Aberdeen comes away with a scoreless tie, and at home, they dominate and defeat the Belgian side 4-1 and are through to the quarterfinals to meet Hungarian side Újpest Dózsa. Lose the first leg in the quarterfinals against the Hungarian side 2-0. However, they stage a comeback in the second leg at Pittodrie and take the match into extra time and advance with a 3-0 win on the back of a Mark McGee hat trick. They reach the semifinals and they meet the Portuguese side Porto. But that was one round too many. And they lose 1-0 home and away and are eliminated. And really, the adventure of the great Aberdeen side ends at this point. Despite reaching the semifinals for the second year in a row, there had been some scare against the Hungarians, Újpest, and of course, losing at home and away to Porto.
The first point I would make here is that by this time in European football, the coefficient had kicked in. And basically what the coefficient means is the more games you win, the higher seeding that you get. So that when you get into the early draws in European football, you get teams who are regarded as being below your level. So in terms of the coefficient, Aberdeen get Akranes from Iceland, who put a real fight up against Aberdeen, I've got to say, more so than you would expect. And they had a guy called Siggy Jonsson, who was a young boy at the time, who was regarded as one of the best midfield players in European football. And he was the guy over the two games who came to light. And in fact, from memory, I'm sure Aberdeen tried to sign him on the back of that, but couldn't get him. And then in the next round, they were expected to beat Bevern because, with the greatest respect to Bevern, they weren't Anderlecht and they weren't Bruges. They weren't perceived as being one of the top class Belgian sides, despite having won the league title, and Aberdeen won very comfortably. And as you said there, when they played Újpest, they lost 2-0 in the first leg. One of the few games, I think I recall, when Ferguson was really angry with his side's performance. He described it as unacceptable. And in the second leg, they had to work hard. As you said there, a Mark McGee hat-trick, 3-0. I made the point earlier that at Pittodrie, Aberdeen could rely on beating anybody at this stage. So by the time they played Porto in the semi-finals, Aberdeen are the favourites. They are the holders, as you say. Porto, certainly a notable side within European football. Portugal is a major footballing nation. But even when Aberdeen lost the first leg, the perception was that they would raise their game as they had done against Újpest to win the second leg and get to the final. It was a real disappointment for them. Now, in the second leg, away goals counting in those days, when Porto scored at Pittodrie, I think it was fairly late on, the game was over at that point. So it shows you the standard that Aberdeen had achieved when you could go into a European semi-final and regard yourselves as disappointed when you lose to a very good team. And the big disappointment, I think, was for them, it was Juventus in the final, the Juventus of Platini and Boniek, of Scirea and Tardelli, great Italian legends that Juventus had at the time. And that would have been a really special occasion to have seen Aberdeen against Juventus in a final.
I guess the consolation was that Aberdeen won the league title that season. Now, despite Aberdeen's successes that included winning league titles in these years, there was the reality that they could not compete on the money front. And in the summer of 1984, Gordon Strachan left to join Ron Atkinson at Manchester United, and Mark McGee joined SV Hamburg.
Yeah, they lost Steve Archibald to Spurs in 1980, as I mentioned earlier. And between 1980 and 1984, Aberdeen did tremendously well to hang on to all those exceptional players in which they had. I don't think people appreciate the resources that Aberdeen had, because their average crowd at the time would have been something along the lines of maybe about 13,000. Certainly when they played Celtic and Rangers at Pittodrie, they would have got full houses. And when they played European teams, they always get big attendances. But in general terms, they weren't a particularly well-supported club. So in terms of finance, it was always going to be difficult for them to hold on to their best players. But the one thing I would have to say here is Strachan's loss was immeasurable. He was, as I've already described, a truly world-class player, one of those players that you only get once in a generation. There's no way that Aberdeen could really have hoped to have replaced him. It would have been very, very difficult for any club to replace somebody of Strachan's calibre. From that point onwards, I think the creative aspect of Aberdeen's play was never quite the same again. They were still an exceptional side, but Strachan, he was just such a talented player. It was so difficult to replace him. Mark McGee went to Hamburg on the back of his performances in the UEFA Cup ties and the Super Cup ties. Hamburg were very keen on Mark McGee. He wasn't so much a loss for Aberdeen because they signed a guy called Frank McDougall from St Mirren, and McDougall actually outscored Mark McGee in the seasons that followed. So I don't think McGee's loss was felt as much as losing Strachan. But Rangers find it hard to retain players in the Scottish game because we are such a small country. And also, freedom of contract had now kicked in, whereby when the players got to the end of their contracts, they could move on. There was nothing the club could do. So that was always going to be difficult for Scottish clubs. And I think Aberdeen felt the impact of that when Strachan and McGee moved in the summer of 1984. And also, it has to be said, Doug Rugby went to Chelsea that summer. And he's not remembered possibly in the same vein as the likes of Strachan and McGee. But he was a cult hero to the Aberdeen fans. He was a very important player during the Aberdeen glory years. So there was 3 players that Ferguson had to replace that, and it's very, very difficult for a club of Aberdeen's resources, even if they get big transfer fees, to go out and replace such quality players with a similar quality.
For the following season, 1984-85, Aberdeen are in the Champions Cup. And in the first round, they faced East German champions Dynamo Berlin. They win 2-1 at Pittodrie. They lose 2-1 at East Berlin and are eventually eliminated after a penalty kick shootout after extra time. They had been eliminated in the first round in a long time. And obviously, Strachan's loss was felt. And again, the only compensation that season was, again, winning the league title for the second year running. We come to the 85-86 season, and Aberdeen are again in the Champions Cup. They face again the Icelandic side, Akrans. This time it's much more comfortable for Aberdeen. They win 3-1 away from home and 4-1 at home. In the second round, they face Swiss side Servette of Geneva. In the first round, away from home, they come away with a scoreless tie and just narrowly defeat them in the second leg 1-0 with Frank McDougall scoring, and Aberdeen are through to the quarterfinals. In the quarterfinals, they meet Swedish side IFK Gothenburg. At home, they are held to a 2-2 tie. In fact, the Swedes score a minute before the end, as Aberdeen looked like they were going to win this game. And in the second leg, Gothenburg holds Aberdeen to a scoreless tie, and Aberdeen are eliminated on the away goals rule. This is the end of the adventure of the great Aberdeen side of Sir Alex Ferguson.
Having won the league in 84 and 85, Aberdeen would no doubt have been looking to make an impact in the European Cup in the same way that they had done in the Cup Winners' Cup. In 84, they were very unlucky to get drawn against Dynamo Berlin because Berlin were a very, very good side. And losing in is a really sore way to lose any game. But I hate to keep going on about it, but if Strachan had been playing, then he would have been the difference for me against a side like Berlin. They no longer had Strachan. They no longer had that something special to unlock teams during a tight game. Having said that, they weren't far off it. As I said, it went to penalties. It was a bit of a lottery, so that would have been a sore one. It was a sore one. Moving on to the next season, when they beat Akranis and then they beat Servette, I think by the time they get to the quarter final, they're looking really to make an impact in this season. They're putting all the resources into the Gothenburg quarter-final ties. Now, Gothenburg themselves, unknown to some people, had a great reputation within European football at that time, and were very much the prominent team from Sweden. But Aberdeen, for me, would have been favourites at that time, given their pedigree that they had achieved in the seasons leading up to that game. But I think the difference between the teams over the two legs was a guy called Johnny Ekstrom, who was a phenomenally talented player, very, very strong player. And for the first time, I remember seeing Willie Miller and Alec McLeish struggle against Ekstrom. He was an exceptional player. He was one of the best players in the European game at that time. And his physique alone, he was a strong, pacey player. Over the two legs, he gave Miller and McLeish quite a torrid time, especially in the game at Pittodrie. But my recollection of the second leg, when it was nothing each, was that Gothenburg played a cagey game, knowing that they had the two away goals in the bag that gave them the advantage of a nothing each draw. And again, I think most observers were saying that Peter Weir was injured for that game, I'm sure. So without Strachan or Peter Weir, who were Aberdeen's two main creative outlets, it was very, very difficult for them to break down such a good Swedish defence. And in the end, they just weren't good enough to break through. They had signed Jim Bett at the time, who was a fine player for Scotland over that period. But Jim Bett was a notable signing, but he was a good player in his own right, but he didn't have Strachan's creativity and Strachan's ability to do the unusual on the pitch. Aberdeen lost on away goals in a tie that in another year they could have won that and been in the semi-finals, and after that you never know.
This was more or less the end of the great Aberdeen side in Europe. In the following season, they're in the Cup Winners' Cup and are eliminated by the Swiss side Sion, whom they had demolished just a couple of years before. They win 2-1 at home and they lose 3-0 away from home. It's at this point that also Sir Alex Ferguson leaves the club to start his great adventure at Manchester United. Was there a feeling that Alex Ferguson had gone as far as he could in Europe and domestically as well with Aberdeen?
Yeah, losing to Sion was a huge blow. This was a team that Aberdeen had thrashed in 1982. And yet, within a few years later, Sion won the second leg 3-0 in Switzerland. So this was an eye-opener, and for the first time during Alec Ferguson's reign at Pittodrie, the word crisis got mentioned. Because, as you said, there was a feeling that possibly Aberdeen had went as far as he could take them. Now, never for a minute would I accuse Alec Ferguson of being a lucky manager, but he was very fortunate with timing twice in his career. The first time it came in the summer of 1978, when St Mirren had sacked him, which is really hard to believe that Alec Ferguson could get the sack. St Mirren had sacked him and he was out of work. And then Celtic parted company with Jock Stein, and Billy McNeill, who was the Aberdeen manager, moved to Celtic to replace Jock Stein. So Aberdeen need a replacement for Billy McNeill, and Alec Ferguson is sitting there basically out of work and a ready-made replacement. So in terms of timing, it was absolutely perfect both for Aberdeen and for Alec Ferguson. And in 1986, it's very similar because Aberdeen are on the slide. I don't mean that they're a bad team at this point. I mean that they're no longer the exceptional team that they were 2 or 3 years previously. So Manchester United come along and they need a new manager, and that allows Alex Ferguson to leave and move on to a bigger league, a bigger platform as the manager of Manchester United. So he is, again, fortunate at that time that there's almost a way out for him, because it would have been very interesting to see how Ferguson would have coped with Rangers in particular. As Graham Souness had taken over as player manager, Rangers began to sign international class players. They spent a huge amount of money. They were getting huge attendances. It was almost like a juggernaut within the Scottish game. They became so powerful. And the balance in Scottish football had tipped in Rangers' favour against, up to that point, Aberdeen and Celtic had been the two main sides, with Dundee United also, I've got to say. He also lost in the summer of 1986 two of his best young players, Eric Black and Neil Cooper. Eric Black decided to go to Metz in France, and Neil Cooper went to Aston Villa. Both of them went for very significant transfer fees, but I think there was a realisation, certainly for Ferguson, that he could no longer control these young guys. Up to that point, he was able to retain them at Aberdeen and look to them to be the backbone of the future Aberdeen sides. But I think when it became apparent that the young guys were wanting to move on for financial reasons, basically, I think Ferguson himself maybe came to the conclusion that it was also time for him to move on, and that Manchester United gave him a really good opportunity to move out at a time when Aberdeen were still strong within the Scottish game.
So he's replaced by Ian Porterfield on the bench. The following season, 87-88, Aberdeen are in the UEFA Cup. In the first round, they face Irish side Bohemian. They come away with a scoreless tie away from home and won just 1-0 at home. In the second round, they face Dutch side Feyenoord. They win 2-1 at home, but they lose 1-0 away and are out due to the away goals rule. At this point, it's evident that Aberdeen are no longer the force they had been just a few years before. How did Ian Porterfield perform in Europe in this short spell at the club?
But when Ian Porterfield took over at Pittodrie, it was described as a poison chalice, because anybody who replaced Alex Ferguson had huge shoes to fill. And I think that when you look at what happened when he left Manchester United, to this day, they haven't replaced him sufficiently with all the resources and the finance that Man United had. So Aberdeen took a wee risk in Ian Porterfield. He had been down in England for many years as a player and a manager. He was probably a quite ambitious appointment. He was very keen to do well, but by now Celtic and Rangers were paying big fees for players. For example, Aberdeen had a guy called Joe Miller, who was an exceptionally young footballer, and he signed for Celtic. So that was a bad blow for Aberdeen, because Aberdeen were hoping that the likes of Joe Miller would be the future Aberdeen side. So Ian Porterfield finding it difficult. In terms of European ties, it was closer than it had to be against Bohemians. That was a bit of a shock at the time. But he was very unlucky against Feyenoord again to losing away goals. But the perception at the time was that although Feyenoord are a big name within European football, Aberdeen had beaten better teams than that in the previous seasons, far better teams than Feyenoord. And I think the realisation was that Aberdeen were now, within the European game, an ordinary team and no longer to be feared in the way that they were in the early to mid-1980s. So they were a club in transition. There were more departures. Jim Leighton went to Manchester United, and the likes of Dougie Bell, Peter Weir moved on, who'd been big players for Aberdeen. And I think that one of the sad aspects was that Frank McDougall received an injury that he had to retire from football. So Porterfield had a lot to contend with. There was a lot of bad luck at the time, but replacing Alex Ferguson, that was a really hard thing to do.
You already mentioned that the arrival of Graham Souness at Rangers and the spending effect, Aberdeen and the other teams in Scotland, they just could not compete with the big two at this point.
Yeah, I mean, even Celtic for a few years couldn't compete with the Rangers' financial muscle. Celtic actually had a boardroom revolution in order to compete with Rangers and bring in fresh finance. What's kind of surprised about Aberdeen was that the North Sea oil industry was booming at the time, and Aberdeen as a city was a fairly affluent place. But it's quite surprising why Aberdeen didn't really get a sponsorship deal with the likes of Shell and Esso and BP, the big oil companies, because not only would it have been good for Aberdeen, but it would have been good for those companies to get in the back of the success of Aberdeen as a club. For whatever reason, I'm not quite sure, that never materialised. That always seemed very strange to me. But it was now going to become harder for Aberdeen to compete at the domestic level, never mind within European football.
Alex Smith is appointed as manager for the 1988-89 season. We also have the arrival of Charlie Nicholas, the former Celtic star, as part of the team. Now, for this season, they face East German side Dynamo Dresden. The first leg at home, they are held to a scoreless tie, and in the second leg, they lose 2-0 and are eliminated in the first round. So we come to the next season, 89-90, and near end of the decade. And again in the UEFA Cup with Alex Smith in charge, they face Austrian side Rapid Vienna. They win 2-1 at home, but again lose 1-0 away from home and are eliminated due to the away goals rule. This ends Aberdeen's decade in Europe of the 1980s. Alex Smith was just as unsuccessful in Europe as Porterfield had been. What was the takeaway of this duo's spell in charge in Europe?
First of all, in terms of the games against Dresden, my recollection is that Dresden won those ties well. They struggled a wee bit. I think you have to point out at this point that Willie Miller was becoming injury prone. And just as Aberdeen found it very difficult to replace Alec Ferguson as a manager, they were similarly always going to find it difficult to replace Willie Miller, who was an Aberdeen playing legend. They were unlucky in the away goals rule against Vienna. To be honest, these ties weren't very exciting for Aberdeen fans, I think. Losing to what I would call middle-class European sides that Ferguson's teams would have beaten, it was very difficult for Aberdeen fans to come to the conclusion that they were no longer able to compete at the level that they had been a couple of years previously. So Alex Smith was a safe pair of hands. He was a good manager, decent manager. But what he was trying to do at this time was he was trying to build a team on youth. There was players such as Ian Jess and Scott Booth, Stephen Wright, who were very good players, who had good careers. But there was a couple of exceptional signings that I've got to mention as well. Charlie Nicholas was an outstanding signing for Aberdeen at that point to get a player of his calibre. And they signed a Dutch guy called Hans Gilhuis, who was from PSV Eindhoven. That was an exceptional piece of business as well for Aberdeen. So they still had good players, but I think overall they still weren't as strong as a team, as a unit. And also, with the greatest respect to Porterfield and Ian Smith, Alex Smith, they didn't have Ferguson's personality to drive them on to the next level. Ferguson was very driven. He was a great communicator. He was a great motivator. All the things that people would have recalled from his years at Manchester United. He was doing that previously at Aberdeen with great success. So there's no disgrace in losing to Rapid Vienna, for example, or even Dynamo Dresden. But the perception is still that these are teams that a couple of years before that Aberdeen would have beat without too much effort.
Aberdeen relied mainly on home-based players until the tail end of this decade, and they started signing players like the Englishman Paul Mason and Dutchmen like the goalkeeper Theo Snelders and Willem van der Ark. Do you think they should have signed foreign players earlier, or perhaps there was not so much money to sign top foreign players for a team like Aberdeen?
Porterfield had tried to sign players from the English League, but without great success. He'd signed a guy called Keith Edwards from Sheffield United, who had a great pedigree in England, but never really came to much at Aberdeen. He signed a guy called Tom Jones, and he signed a guy called Peter Nicholas, who was a Welsh internationalist, a very aggressive midfield player. So I think he tried the English market without any great success. So when Alex Smith came in, he decided to go down the Dutch route with more success. You've mentioned the players there from Holland. The likes of Mason and Schnelders, Willem van der Ark. But the exceptional one was Hans Gilhouse. As I've said previously, he was an outstanding player of the highest calibre. Showed that at Pittodrie for a short period. Aberdeen's strength, to be honest, was always in their youth policy. And it was something that they always focused on from the early 1970s all the way through to the late 1980s. Aberdeen at any given time always had a good youth setup whereby they could bring players through from the youth system into the first team. That was always the plan, to create their own talent from within the club.
Discussion last time regarding Celtic, we somewhat touched up on this, that due to the Heysel ban, perhaps playing in Europe could have attracted more players from England. But in this case as well, it didn't seem to, or maybe they didn't pursue English players as much.
Yeah, I think it was a wee bit more easier for Rangers to go down that route because they had a lot of finance behind them and they had big attendances. They were creating a lot of money on the back of that. Aberdeen were different. They were still getting crowds. As I said, the average was always maybe about 13,000, 14,000 for Aberdeen. So another thing as well is they had very capable board of directors, a very small board, and they were financially reluctant to get into debt and pay big transfers. They were very financially well run. So what they didn't want to do was to overstep the mark and end up in debt and all the bad things that come from clubs that go into debt. So that there was a reluctance to spend huge amounts of money and huge wages the way that Rangers did. They couldn't hope to compete with Rangers at that point.
At the end of this decade, Aberdeen were no longer a force domestically and naturally struggled in Europe. Was the objective to be more stable at the domestic level, and perhaps Europe was an afterthought at this point?
Yeah, there was one Scottish journalist, Alec Ferguson, was the best thing that happened to Aberdeen, and he was the worst thing that ever happened to Aberdeen. And the reason why he said that was that the first part is self-explanatory, that the great European successes and all the glory period that they enjoyed in the 1980s. But the worst thing, the aspect that he meant by that was that Aberdeen fans now had an expectation. When you've won so many league titles and cups, and then you've competed in Europe and you've beaten all these European teams like Real Madrid and Bayern Munich and Hamburg, there was a sense of expectation now that the fans expect that. And that was a hard thing for the fans, I think, to come to terms with, that they could no longer compete at that level. I think it took a few years for it to sink in that what Ferguson had achieved, not only had it been exceptional, but it had probably been virtually impossible for someone to follow on from that, particularly when the game began to change in Europe and freedom of contract had kicked in, the advent of the satellite football, whereby the bigger leagues were beginning to get the TV money that made them stronger. So not only Aberdeen, but teams from Scotland in particular were really finding it hard to compete at a level because the English teams and the European teams were now moving on to a different plane.
Do you think they committed any errors on the European level post Ferguson?
Errors. I really think there's not a great deal more that they could have done post Ferguson. They signed Hans Gill. They did make attempts in the transfer market to compete, and also they had that great youth set up with their young players. But at the end of the day, football moves on, times change. And when Ferguson moved away from Aberdeen, I think that it was tremendously difficult for them to keep that standard of success up, not only within Scotland, but also in the European game.
Looking back at the successes, what were Alex Ferguson's tactical innovations in Europe as opposed to Celtic and Rangers who struggled in Europe in this decade?
The first point I would make here is, and I've already said it previously, was the fact that Ferguson played with two holding midfield players. He defensively set his team up to make them difficult to beat. and also that he had players of a certain calibre who could win the game for them. They mentioned in great detail Gordon Strachan and Peter Weir being the two cases in point. The other thing I also alluded to earlier was the coefficient had now kicked in. And Celtic and Rangers found it difficult because when you lose each season in the lower rounds, then it means that the following season, the first round, you get a harder level of opposition. And what Aberdeen and Dundee United used to their advantage was that they were able to beat teams who were above their station. Therefore, they were getting a better draw.
You already mentioned Strachan. Now, looking at this decade, were there any other particular Aberdeen players who performed consistently in Europe and enhanced their reputation?
Oh, absolutely. It's the obvious ones that we've mentioned already. I mean, Miller and McLeish, both as individuals, but also as a partnership. They were international class players. They were the backbone of the Scottish team for a number of years. But when Scotland had a good side who could qualify for the major tournaments. Strachan, I've already said in detail, and you might have guessed that I'm a huge Gordon Strachan fan as a player. I mean, I absolutely hated him as a Celtic fan because he was so good. There's only two players in the Scottish game, in games against Celtic, that I can recall who were unplayable. One was Gordon Strachan at Aberdeen, and the other one was Brian Laudrup when he was at Rangers. It's hard to describe how good these guys were on their game. And Strachan, when he was in the mood and when he was playing well, there wasn't a great deal that the opposition could do about it. He was a phenomenal footballer. I've already mentioned Dougie Bell as well, because when it came to European games, he was able to raise his game. He gave Aberdeen a different dimension, if you like, in midfield. And then up front, probably the guy who had the best reputation was Mark McGee. I say that in an obvious way because when Hamburg made a point of signing him in 1984 on the back of his performances against them. The sad thing for McGee was when he went to Germany, he had injury problems and he couldn't do himself justice and ended up coming back to Celtic within a short period of time. But those for me were the main players, the backbone of the Aberdeen side, who, in terms of the European games, were the main men for them.
I remember in one of his columns, Brian Glanville felt that given his resources, Ferguson's achievements at Aberdeen were even more impressive than what he achieved with Manchester United. Is this a takeaway in Scotland?
Yes. I would even go back before that to his time at St Mirren, where he revolutionised St Mirren from being a team in the lower divisions to being a team within the Scottish Premier League who were above their weight and had very good players. From a St Mirren perspective, they sacked him in 1978, which wasn't a football decision, it was a financial decision. There was some sort of dubiety about some financial arrangement. Mirren fans regret to this day because the feeling that St Mirren fans have is how much could Ferguson have developed their club if he hadn't gone to Aberdeen in 1978 and he'd have stayed at St Mirren. So, yeah, he moves on to Aberdeen. Within a short space of time, he's doing these fantastic things at Pittodrie, winning trophies, performing to a high degree in European football. So I've already tried to explain the resources that Aberdeen had in terms of like gates of 13,000 or whatever, and the financial aspect that they couldn't hope to compete with big clubs in the transfer market. So, yeah, I think his achievements with Aberdeen more than stand up with anything that he did at Manchester United, because at Manchester United, you have the resources, you have the finances, and you also have the expectation that it is Manchester United and they should be competing at the highest level. That's not the case with any Scottish club, to be honest.
In retrospect, was Aberdeen's success in 1983 considered an anomaly, or was it the fruit of years of planning and progress?
In fairness to them, I think it was years of planning. As I've said there, they had a very good board of directors, and Ferguson himself And virtually every Aberdeen manager of that period of the 1970s, they all comment on how supportive the board of directors were. For example, they went down the road of having an all-seated stadium at a time when that wasn't. If they weren't the first club in Scotland to do it, they might have been the second club in Scotland to do it. But they had an all-seated stadium before Celtic and Rangers had it. They were very forward-thinking at board level. They were very supportive to Ferguson. They may not have spent a huge amount in the transfer market, but what they did do was they kept the players happy. And there was a 4-year period there between 1980 and 1984 when Aberdeen were at their peak, that many a board of directors would have looked to have cashed in on those big assets that they had for financial gain. But the Aberdeen board remained strong and held on to their best players, which gave Ferguson the opportunity to compete with the best teams in Europe. And it also gave the fans a chance to enjoy the best football years of their lives. So the Aberdeen Board of Directors under, I think Dick Donald was the first chairman and Chris Anderson was second. They were not only admired by the Aberdeen fans, they were admired, I think, in general by everyone within the Scottish game because they were so far ahead of their time in many, many ways. So that the plans were afoot for Aberdeen to move on to the next level. If there was a bit of good fortune, as I've said there, Ferguson being out of work in 1978, they didn't need to go far. They didn't need to pay any compensation. And he moved in there at a time where he had the nucleus and the backbone of a great team. He had Leighton and Miller and McLeish were already there. He had Gordon Strachan, he had Steve Archibald. So it really looked like it was a wee bit of fine tuning. He would have known at that point that he had an exceptional playing squad. He just had to get them to believe in themselves so that they could achieve the level of success that he believed they were capable of. They benefited from his managerial experience, making them better players, and he benefited from the players making him a better manager. So all round, it was very much a win-win situation for Aberdeen.
Do you think Aberdeen's success was solely based on the man in charge, and with his departure, the decline was inevitable no matter who was in charge?
Yeah, Billy McNeill had signed Strachan and Archibald, and if he hadn't moved to Celtic in 78, I suppose it's interesting to see how far he could have progressed with Aberdeen. So not to say for a minute that what Ferguson did wasn't down to him as a manager, because Ferguson is a personality, and again, we all think back of his time at Manchester United. He's very much a motivator, but he's very aggressive. He's got a great will to win, and he managed to instill that in his players. He used to make the point that he wanted to go to Glasgow, not just to compete. He wanted to go to Glasgow, to Hampden, to Celtic Park, to Ibrox, and beat them, and he did beat them on a regular basis. So there's total respect for what he achieved in that way. Could they have done it without him? Probably not. You know, I think every great club and that has success over a period, it's the chemistry. It's the mix between the manager, the players, the board of directors, and it's about everything coming together at the one time. And I think if Aberdeen had good fortune, if you like, they had all those things which all came together, that the stars aligned, if you like, to allow them to have that great period of success. But I've already made the phrase there about it was a poison chalice for anybody who replaced Ferguson. Manchester United, as we all know, are still finding it hard after all this time to find a suitable replacement for Alex Ferguson. So if they can't do it, then you can realise the scale of the problem that Aberdeen had to replace him. Because you weren't just replacing a manager, you were replacing a personality. You were replacing somebody who had such an outstanding presence within Scottish football and also within European football.
In closing, from fans and historians alike, what is the legacy of Aberdeen's European performances in the decade of the 1980s?
I would say that looking back on it, between 1980 and 1985, I would have said that Aberdeen were capable of beating any team in European football. There's not a lot of clubs at any time in football history you can say that about. They competed at the highest level, they won at the highest level, and they were respected at the highest level. But it's one thing getting to that level of success. It's another thing retaining that level of success, and nothing lasts forever. Looking back on it, they were an exceptional side with an exceptional manager who had exceptional success. And I think when the history of European football was written within the 1980s, Aberdeen will always be to the forefront of that, and that's to their great credit.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. As always, feel free to leave questions and comments. Again, all our respective contact information is listed on the blog and podcast listings, including the links to Mr. Murray's books. So, thank you once again, and hope to continue these discussions on Scottish football history.
Thank you very much. Most enjoyable.
Thank you.